Keep yourself in the loop of everything football on the Golden State Media Concepts Football Podcast. The latest news on and off the field, be it college football, Big 10, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC to the NFL. We've got you covered. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Football Podcast.
Welcome in to the GSMC Football Podcast right here at the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Brice Lewis, back at it again with another podcast discussing all things football. This podcast today is going to be more college heavy. Obviously, that's where most of the news is coming from right now in sports, because the college football season is currently in shambles right now. So we're going to discuss all the latest developments on that. We do have some NFL news, though, so we're obviously going to fit some in there as well, talk about a couple of signings and things like that are happening all around the league as well. But today's show will mainly be focused on the college football spectrum in the world of college football right now, which is currently in shambles for a lot of teams, a lot of conferences, as the ongoing concern and the ongoing that the entire college football season will be canceled continues to grow. And right now we are currently headed towards that unless these remaining conferences stay on course and say we are playing the season no matter what. So basically we're going to get into it right off the bat. Obviously, if you've heard this week, the Big 10 and the Pac-12 have canceled their respective seasons. And I think they said the Big 10 may be trying to potentially play a season in spring. So we're going to go ahead and talk about each conference's decision, in my opinion. And then, is it possible to play a season in spring also? So we're going to start with the Pac-12. Now, obviously, the Pac-12, they were the first, I guess you could say, conference that came out, at least from the players, to say, listen, if you want us to play, we want to play, but we need to make sure this is insured for us to play. So, and they were the first to actually change their schedule, to eliminate non-conference games. Like, they were the first to make adjustments to their schedule to try to make it work. But obviously, as you know, the Pac-12 has about about 2 or 3 teams in California, which is a heavy coronavirus state, plus in other states around it. And I think the Pac-12 came to this decision based off the fact that they looked at it and said, it's going to be extremely difficult for us to be able to have a season and then be able to promise parents that their kids won't get infected with COVID-19 and potentially have long-term effects. If you can't guarantee the kid's safety, then is it worth playing, is the question. Now, yes, there are demographics and stuff that shows, younger people are more likely not to have anything bad happen because of COVID, but it's still possible. And if there's a possibility for it, why risk it? Yeah, 20 players may test positive, but that one player might be bedridden. That one player might have breathing problems for the rest. He may not be able to taste for the rest of his life. You never know how it could happen with these players. So you can't just assume that, they're young, they'll be fine. And I think the Pac-12 knew that, and they said, you know what? We're just going to cancel. We are just going to cancel our season, and we're just going to have to gear up for the next year. Now, obviously, players are disappointed, clearly, because they wanted to play. It's just they wanted certain conditions, man. And it brings up a question of, is it possible that the conferences canceled because they didn't want to have to abide by player demands a little bit? They knew what the players were asking for. They really didn't want to go and have to do. So they just said, you know what, just cancel this entire situation. Let's just cancel the season so we don't have to worry about any of that. And then we can get back to, because, if you cancel the season and they don't play a season, the expectation obviously would be by this point next year, coronavirus would be a thing of the past. It wouldn't be here anymore. Vaccines would have been released and we would be able to go back to our daily lives. So the football season would be able to come back. So obviously the big issue with that is obviously everybody's losing a year. So potentially with them losing a year, it, could affect a lot of different things. Will players who are fifth-year seniors or seniors get that extra year of eligibility back, or will they have to leave? I think that's a big part of it too, because, I think that a lot of people wonder if that's something that will happen. And I think that's the most important thing I think that's out there right now is what's going to come out of the whole situation. That's what's going to come out of everything that happens. And I think that's the most important thing right now. It's one of those things that it makes sense, and it's logical to me that you should give the players back another year of eligibility because they didn't play. Now, the only issue is that you're still going to have the new upcoming freshman class. So what I think they need to do is maybe give a second year red shirt potentially. You may have to do a double red shirt. Because obviously, first you have to expand rosters, and second you have to do double red shirts. So now, because literally if you think about it, unless you have players going to the draft that from your team this year, the players who were not going to go to the draft and just were going to play out their last year and they were a starter or something like that, you got to think about it. What are you going to do with them? You can't just say, oh yeah, we going to give somebody else your job now. I mean, realistically, you're going to probably keep a lot of those players in the same spots. So realistically, you're just going to have more depth. And you just got to redshirt people. I mean, obviously, you never know with this, could it spread out recruiting? Because now players are coming into situations knowing not only are you dealing with last year's class that didn't play, now you got to do it for your current class that's coming in. And basically, teams have not really, in terms of, like I said, unless people transferred or went to the draft, not a lot of movement was made on the roster to create space for you to play. So could this spread out recruiting potentially? Could recruits now decide to go to different colleges that maybe don't always get the recruits like that because they're looking for intermediate playing time, and rosters would be stacked because of the fact that everybody's retaining a year of eligibility. So so the Pac-12 obviously, I think, was the first one to make moves on this, and they've always been the more proactive conference, I feel like, out of all the conferences so far during the coronavirus pandemic. And then that brings us into the Big Ten. And so, the Big Ten, they were, I guess you could say, the second team who was proactive in trying to decide what to do. Obviously Jim Harbaugh came out earlier in the week and said that he thinks that they should play this season. But obviously the Big Ten said, no, we're not playing the season. We're going to make a decision again based off of what's the safest and protect our players. And we're going to make sure that everybody is good. As I think they should. Yes, Justin Fields and all of them said they want to play, they want to start a players coalition, also had demands for the Big Ten. So it's just a revolving door of a bunch of just what ifs and what's next and everything like that. I think it's important that, the Big Ten, I think, the Pac-12, I think, out of all the group of 5 conferences, was looked at as like the 5th most important conference out of the 5. Like, if we're being honest, Pac-12 was not what they used to be. Back in the day, it was Pac-12, SEC, then maybe Big 12, maybe Big 10, one of the two, probably Big 10, then Big 12, then ACC. ACC is, outside of Clemson, they don't really have much going for them, but they still are kind of more relevant than the Pac-12. Because they do have a team that represents them every year in the playoff and in the national championship in Clemson. So the Pac-12 was ended. Big 10 now is probably third, if not second. And now they're opting out. And so it's a process that I think is going to take some time to kind of see what happens. I think the Big Ten was trying to play their season in the spring, which I think, again, would be interesting because it kind of leads me into my next topic. How would a spring season work? And then what the risk factors of playing a spring season? Because now it's like, okay, is this going to be a condensed season? Because remember, our college football season lasts from September, like regular season usually lasts from September to December, like the early part of December. So that's about 4 months, right? So if you play the season from January to April, and I'm talking about just the regular season and plus their championship games. We're not even talking about bowl games or national championships or anything like that. Usually, they have spring camp in April, in May. They usually have their spring practices. Then you have the season in September. You play, so think about it. Let's say you end your season in December. You don't play again till next September. You're in your season in April. You're playing again in September. That's only another 4-month gap. So you play 4 months. You get 4 months off. So, you're getting some time off. So it's not like, oh, they're not getting any time off. If you think about it, the NFL, if you play the Super Bowl, ends in February, you play again in August, March, April, May, June, July. You get 5 months before you got to gear back up for training camp. Even though you have practices here and there, and contact things. So it's risky to kind of do that. And then you got to think about all the players who are going to the draft. I feel like any player who's thinking about going to the draft will leave. Because you can't be currently playing and then put your name in the draft. Basically any player who is going to go to the draft would have to opt out for sure. They would have to. There's no way they can stay and play another year. Unless they're willing to wait another year if they have another year of eligibility to enter the draft. Because what if you were a 5th round pick and you were like, okay, this year I'm going to get my draft stock up, and then now they're canceling it and moving it back to spring. Well, but you got another year of eligibility left. Because let's say you want to leave as a junior. You may have to leave as a senior now if you want to really get that year in. Because obviously the biggest issue with that would just be player health. You don't want players to be hurt. You don't want players to get injured. Obviously that's a very big part of what they want to do is reduce that. So obviously that'd be the only dangerous part of potentially putting the players in a situation where they have to go hard. Because the thing is, after the season ends, so when do you start spring practices and gearing up for the next regular season? You got to give the players some off time to rest their bodies. You can't just go football all the way through the entire calendar year. You see what I'm saying? How would that work? Are you going to start spring practices up in August and just say we're just going to have a month of spring practices and then just go into the season? Will they have to push back the season? Honestly, I think they could. They could push it back to middle to late September, and then you just finish out your championship games. Because if you think about it, college football regular season doesn't play too deep into December. So you could move it back into September, and then just have the season end later in December. You could do that. It could work that way, but we don't know how flexible every conference is going to be with their schedule. Because remember, it's not the NCAA making that decision. It's the respective conferences making that decision on their schedule. And obviously you would hope that everybody's kind of on the same page when it comes to the schedule, because it'd be weird if Pac-12's playing until December 25th, but its SEC's ending December 8th, and then the Big Ten's ending December 12th, and then the next team, Big Pac-12's ending December 15th. It's just okay, we're all over the place. And then, we got the college football playoff. Usually every team ends the same week, so then who's going to play for the playoff. Well, we can't December because we got to wait for them to play. We got to wait for them to play. We got to wait for them to play. You're having to wait a long time just to get that. Then you can't even do the bowl games because of that. It's just, it's scheduling has to kind of be even. So it kind of has to be a mutual conference agreement. It can't just be you, and you got your own date, and you got your own date, and you got your own date. It has to be a more mutual, exclusive decision here by all the conferences coming together. That's why it's important to me that all the conferences come together, I think, and discuss, okay, what's best for our respective conferences. Because I feel like during this coronavirus pandemic, I don't think we need to be dividing our decisions on terms of what we're going to do with the season for ours. We need to be coming together to make these decisions. But that's all we have here for this segment. Coming up next, we're going to get into the last 3 college football conferences that haven't made the decision. I'll discuss why they may be holding out. Plus, stay tuned for a special message if you want to learn more about getting into sports betting right here on the podcast. Listen up, sports bettors. This is Brice, here to tell you about my favorite sports book, and that's BetUS. Football, basketball, and baseball are all back, and that means it's time to get down your bets. I only endorse one sports book, and that's BetUS.com. Why, you ask? BetUS is the pioneer in online betting with more than 25 years in the biz. You need a sports book with integrity and longevity, and you need to know that you're going to get paid. You need a sports book that's going to offer everything, including live betting, MMA, golf, horses, esports, entertainment, and all kinds of crazy prop bets and futures. Call today at 1-800-MyBetUS. That's 1-800-MyBetUS, and they will talk you through getting started. Nobody in the industry gives bigger bonuses than BetUS. Join now, mention GSMC, and you can get up to 150% in bonuses on your first deposit. Nobody beats that. I bet at BetUS, and so should you. Join BetUS today. That's BetUS.com or call 1-800-MyBetUS. Mention GSMC to get 150 in bonuses on your first deposit.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's GSMCpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Football Podcast, right here on the GSMC Podcast Network. Last segment, we discussed the two conferences that have decided to opt out of this season, the Pac-12 and the Big 10. I discussed my thoughts on why I believe that this was the decisions they made. I do believe that these are both the right decisions. And we also talked about, obviously, the Big 10 was exploring potentially playing in the spring. And I discussed some of the challenges of playing in the spring season if they did, because of just anybody who went to the draft would have to leave because they wouldn't be able to play if they were planning to play, or they'd have to stay that extra year if they had the year of eligibility. Because, I mean, remember, if you're able to retain your year of eligibility, you might see that. You would have to also worry about player safety. Would you reduce the season potentially so that way you could get the season through quicker, so then you could give as much time as possible for the players to rest their bodies before starting up the next season? I also suggested maybe pushing back the start of the next season, because I really realistically they could do that, and if they did, that could maybe work. So there was a lot of things we discussed about it and what the potential options they could go down with this decision. So now this segment, we're going to switch to the three conferences that I've still decided to opt in, and we're going to discuss each conference, in my opinion, on why I think they decided to still basically try to play the season out, even with all the risks at hand. So, well, I guess we'll start with the Big 12. Because obviously, the Big 12 is a team that, or a conference, obviously consists of Oklahoma, who has represented the Big 12 in the college football playoff the last few years. Obviously Texas, obviously big powerhouse, Baylor, all of them. One reason to me why I think potentially they haven't decided to do this is because I truly think that in the Big 12's case, I think the three conferences that are left, they may have a different structure financially. Where, of course, every conference usually makes most of their money off their football program. But maybe you got to think about some of the blue chip programs, and you can say, well, the Big 10 has blue chip programs, while Ohio State and Michigan make them tons of money, so then they cancel. But maybe the Big 10's in better condition financially, where they could maybe afford. Plus, again, they are trying to play the season in spring, so there's a chance. To me, the Big 12 is surprising because the colleges that are located in these prospective conferences, in that conference especially, are located in some hot spot states like Texas. And so I feel like, and remember, most of the cases that we saw came from those respective, conferences as well. And I wonder, it's funny because the Big 12 is one of the few schools you really haven't heard anything from. Like, during this entire coronavirus pandemic, you haven't heard a lot from leaders in the Big 12 and just any news. I don't think even the players have came out and did one of those things where they would say, well, this is our demands. Like, you really haven't heard a lot from Big 12 schools during this entire situation. It's almost just like they've kind of been kind of silent a little bit. So it kind of makes you wonder, like, should they be more proactive with trying to, make changes and trying to adjust things? It's very interesting to me because they have been very quiet and they're going to continue the season as planned. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with the Big 12. Because, like I said, a couple of the schools that play in the conference are located in some hot spot states. So for me, it does kind of like, okay, I mean, if y'all want to do this, then okay, we'll see how it goes. I guess we can see how it plays out. Maybe, obviously, we are about a month away. Actually, not a month away. Yeah, we are still about around a month away, I guess you could say, from the season starting. Month and a couple of weeks. So obviously things could change between now and then. If COVID doesn't get better, I do think you might hear some rumblings come out of there. But obviously, you don't hear a lot come out of there. So that's very interesting to me that you don't hear that much that come from the Big 12 during this entire process. And the same thing is the next conference is the ACC. You haven't really heard too much from the ACC, but I feel like the ACC feels like, as a conference, in terms of just performance football wise, they have, they're not what they used to be. They haven't honestly been that competitive since Florida State, Louisville, and Clemson were the top teams all fighting and jockeying and trying to make it to the national championship picture. Right now, the only team that they can really bang their head on that really leads the conference is Clemson right now, as they're the powerhouse of the conference. Virginia Tech's decent here and there. You got teams that are decent, but nobody who's really, standing out. Obviously, Florida State's fallen off. Louisville's not been the same. But you would think for what some people would consider the most smartest academic football conference in the ACC, that maybe they would be using that here and saying, okay, we should take precautions. But obviously, you've heard, Dabo's out trying to play. I mean, I'm sure, but ACC players, like Trevor Lawrence, he came from the ACC. He said, hey, we need a players coalition. And if a players coalition gets started, would that potentially affect the ACC's decision? Because, you legitimately could say that Trevor Lawrence is the face of the ACC. Like, legitimate, because he's the biggest star in the ACC. So if Trevor Lawrence says that, and now he's the biggest star you have in your own conference, I think you might want to do your due diligence and listen to me. So it's a very interesting perspective to me where the ACC is, because like I said, they're standing on trying to play the season out. They're standing on trying to finish it regardless of what happens. And really, like I said, we'll see if these are actually going to end up being good decisions at the end of the day. It's a tough dilemma, I would say. And if you think about it, there was a map. There was a map that Britt McMurphy tweeted out. And I know this is kind of straying away from the ACC, but one thing I want to point out is that, okay, so on the map it has, all the green colored states are all the teams or all the FBS schools playing in the state. Now, if you look at this map, if you look on his Twitter, all the green states are located in the mid to south. Because that's who's playing. Big 12, ACC, and SEC. Where obviously most of the West ain't playing. Except, like, that one, like, Wyoming. But, you know, who cares about Wyoming? No, I'm playing. But, and then some in the North. But it's mainly the southern ones that are, you know, playing. And honestly, you have to look at the fact that, listen, we live in the South. I live in the SEC country, which we're going to get into next. But, and then, you know, ACC's down here too. Even though we don't consider ACC country, they're down here too. I mean, Clemson's in South Carolina right next to me. These are serious football areas, serious football states. Like, they love this stuff. They love this stuff. I mean, really. They love it. And so I can understand with the type of, you know something, and I know I'm kind of chopping it up, but if you think about it realistically, I mean, this is just facts. In the South towards like Midwest region, they care so much more about football than the West and the North does. Because, I mean, I've met people from the North and I've met people from the West. And yes, football is loved, but it's not viewed as just the heartline, the bloodline, the one vein that keeps you living. You know, it's not viewed as like the end all be all. It's like, we love it, but honestly, the West Coast and North are more basketball areas than football areas. The Midwest to the South are considered very heavy football areas. So it kind of makes sense that all the conferences that are trying to stay opted in are the football heavy ones, and all the ones that football technically isn't their quote unquote number one sport is opting out. It really kind of shows you in terms of just environments and sections of the map who really is a diehard. Because like I said, everybody knows SEC country diehards. You don't really hear Pac-12 fans are diehards. You don't hear Big Ten. I mean, Big Ten is obviously super duper popular, clearly, but you don't view them as the same type of diehards that you do view SEC or Big 12. And so it kind of makes sense why they're hanging on for dear life to try to have the season. And then if we get into the SEC, obviously I've talked about, there's been rumblings that players feel like not enough is being done to protect them. We don't know if the SEC is going to really have anything change. Obviously, the SEC obviously is considered the biggest conference out of all the conferences in the entire college football division. So obviously, if the SEC canceled, I mean if SEC canceled, everybody got canceled. Ain't no way SEC canceling, y'all ain't canceling. SEC is literally the lifeblood of college football. It feels like, especially because always they're getting represented in their biggest games, biggest championship game. They're always getting advertised, talked about. Always some type of SEC school. I mean, you could literally say college football makes a lot of money off the SEC. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like, so I can kind of understand why they're hanging on a little bit longer to not cancel the season more than, you know, an AC or more than a Pac-12 or a Big Ten. You know, and I just think, will it pay off for them? We'll have to see. We'll have to see if it pays off, because if things don't work, it's going to be crazy. But they're the main ones. We kind of have to see how it all kind of works out. I think for me, it's almost like I kind of expect them to hang on as long as they can, just because I know where I live and I know how fans are here. But I think everybody is aware and knows if the SEC decides to cancel the season or can't finish the season, college football will officially, if we don't say that yet, they are officially broken. If the SEC decides to say, we can't do this, we can't play this season out, we can't finish it or whatever. If they give up on it, it's over. Because I don't see the SEC having a spring. I don't see them doing it. If the SEC has to shut it down, they're going to wait till literally the next fall. So, to me, they're really like the lifeblood of college football right now. Because honestly, the ACC could opt out, and it still won't necessarily cancel everything. Even though it would then still feel like, what's the point? You only have 2 major conferences playing. Like, what would be the point? But to me, I think it's just going to be very interesting to kind of see what happens moving forward and going on into the future. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. Hopefully all these respective conferences, to me, I think they need to go ahead and postpone their seasons, but we'll see how everything ends up. We'll have to see how everything turns out for them. So we'll just have to keep an eye on that. But coming up next, we're going to switch to some NFL news. So stay tuned if you want to hear that right here on the podcast.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Football Podcast. Last segment, we discussed the 3 conferences that have left to be opt-out. I kind of gave my thoughts on each one not opting out. What the thinking could be. Obviously, I discussed, the ties in the area as the conferences that have opted out are more football, diehard, heavy. That's the lifeblood of entertainment than the Pac-12 and Big 10 are, where basketball is just as, if not more important than football. So that's why it logically makes sense that they were the first ones to say, you know what, let's shut it down. We're obviously here where football is our number one. It ain't easy to sit here and cancel on something you consider number one in your respective area, in your respective conference. So obviously that's one reason why they were hesitant to do that and make that type of decision. So, we'll have to see how it goes. We'll have to see how they move going forward. So I'm sure there'll be more news. They still have about a month and a couple weeks before their season start. So obviously there's still a lot that can happen between now and then. But now we're going to switch into the NFL. Obviously talk about some NFL news here. A couple of signings, a couple of different things happening. And we're going to get into George Kittle, 49ers. Tight end signs a new record 5 years, $75 million contract extension. Obviously, George Kittle is known as one of the best tight end playmakers in all of the NFL, one of the best offensive playmakers. And now he's getting paid like a top offensive playmaker. And if you're looking for a statistic, in terms of wide receiver salary, he is now 12th, I believe, behind Jarvis Landry. So he's basically getting paid in the top 13 of wide receivers in the game, which should show you how big of a playmaker he is. Obviously, Kittle will receive an $18 million signing bonus and a $30 million guaranteed at signing. There's about $40 million guaranteed in terms of total guarantees, so he can get up to $40 million. Obviously, before this previous season started, Kittle was set to make $2.1 million. Last year, he didn't even make $1 million. So obviously, you know how it is. Significantly underpaid for the production that he puts up. And just the importance of him to the 49ers in that offense. And I think everybody knew with how good he's been, the type of playmaker he is. You knew realistically Kittle was not going to play for just $2.1 million. Yeah, it was a pay raise, but not the type of pay raise that a guy of his caliber and his stature deserves. So it definitely makes sense why he went ahead, and the 49ers, I think, felt that sense of urgency as well to go ahead, get him locked up, because he is probably the best offensive playmaker you've had on your team. Obviously, this whole offseason, tight ends have been getting paid. Obviously, we know before last season, Kyle Rudolph was the highest paid tight end. Then Austin Hooper, this past offseason, signed a 4-year, $42 million deal with the Browns, which made him the highest paid tight end. Now, George Kittle is the highest paid tight end, and we still have to see what Zach Ertz is going to get from the Philadelphia Eagles. And you never know how he could reset the market again for tight ends as well. So obviously, money is getting paid out to the tight end position. The tight end position's money has definitely taken a big increase. Tight ends are becoming so important and being such a big part of teams' offenses that literally your top number 1 or number 2 target could be a tight end. And he could catch 80 balls for 1,000 yards. That's wide receiver numbers. So clearly, a tight end is their value has skyrocketed. They have skyrocketed tremendously. Obviously, if you know the background of George Kittle, he was a 5th round draft pick. So obviously, guy drafted usually to be a backup most of his life, maybe be a core special teamer, but clearly made his leap to become a star. Obviously, him and Jimmy Garoppolo have great chemistry. He hauled in 85 catches for over 1,000 yards and 5 touchdowns in the last offseason. So, clearly, him and Jimmy G have great chemistry. And he's also a very underrated blocking tight end as well. So, George Kittle, only 26, gets his money. As he should deservingly so. But, also, Everson Griffin has made his decision on where he's going to play his football next, and it's with the Dallas Cowboys that he agreed to a 1-year, $6 million contract. Obviously, we knew he was deciding between a couple of teams, and he went with the Cowboys. This contract also includes $3 million in guarantees. This past season, Griffin's only 32 years old, which is still relatively young for a pass rusher. Had 8 sacks, 11 tackles for loss, and 24 quarterback hits last year. So clearly he still could be a very productive player and has definitely upgraded that Dallas Cowboys defensive line. Obviously, he's been a part of the great defenses as well that they've had in Minnesota. So obviously, this was a big move for Cowboys. So obviously they've signed, and the Cowboys have had a sneaky good offseason with signing defensive players. They got HaHa. They got Gerald. They got Poe. They got Griffin. They got Alden. They're signing a lot of guys who some people may feel like may not be in their prime, so to say, but can still play good football at this point. So it's not even like they're downgraded. They've improved their depth and they've improved their talent, I believe, on the defensive end. Obviously, again, the background on Griffin, obviously, was a 4th round pick. He's had over 74 sacks in his career. He's made 3 Pro Bowls. And, hey, if you forget about his contract situation, he actually became a free agent because he met contractual benchmarks that would enable him to avoid the final 3 years of his deal. So he actually had 3 years left, but since he had over 6 sacks and played over 57% of the Vikings' defensive snaps, they were able to free and void up his contract. And that freed up $13 million for the Vikings while also giving Griffin the ability to be able to search for a new team. So obviously, we'll see what he brings to the Cowboys, because obviously the Cowboys are looking for some elite pass rushers. Obviously, they lost Robert Quinn, so obviously they're hoping he can come in and produce and give them some good playing and make some plays for them on the end of the end. Also, ESPN actually made a very interesting move, and they actually reached out to Rams head coach Sean McVay to join the ESPN Monday Night Football booth. That is very, very interesting. And that's interesting to me because, first, that's kind of bold to think that you could approach a head coach of a football team and say, hey, would you want to play in the booth? Like, I'm trying to think, what would you have offered him to make him even think about joining? You know, our conversation was had, according to Andrew Matrian of the New York Post, but no agreement was made, obviously, and we don't know what level of interest McVay conveyed. Obviously, we know ESPN set to say Steve Levy and Brian Griese and Louis Riddick are the new Monday Night Football booth for 2020. But it's just interesting they would reach out to a head coach and think he would actually leave, you know? Like, imagine if you're a head coach of a football team and said, I'm going to the booth. You must have hated your job. I don't see why you would want to leave that just to talk about it now. And I honestly think that would make a very horrible exit because players are like, we're getting left so you could go talk about it instead of coaching us. You know, that's just interesting to me. Obviously, I understand why Sean McVay has had a history or has the reputation of him and his great way of dissecting plays. Because everybody's right now in the booth in terms of football is looking for their next Tony Romo, their next great play-by-play, a guy who could dissect defenses like Tony Romo did. And so I can understand why they made this decision, or they tried to get McVay because they say if we can get like a Tony Romo in there, you know what I'm saying? Then their booth would be very much upgraded. Because people, obviously if they had their comments about the football, booth on ESPN, it's not been the same since really Gruden was there. And ever since then, it's kind of fell off a little bit. And Monday Night Football isn't the same brand it used to be. So, obviously, one big part of it is the booth, the commentary team. And I think maybe that's another reason why. Because if we could bring a name, like McVay in, they may be able to bring that same interest and sparkle back to Monday Night Football that they haven't had in a while. So we'll have to see. But now we're going to read an article. NFL's COVID-19 positive test rate among all players to staff at 0.486%. We're going to read this article based off Paul Kishaban. The NFL released its latest COVID-19 numbers on Wednesday. Per ESPN's Kevin Severt. Among over 100,000 tests of NFL players, coaches, and staff, only 0.46% tested positive. Among only players, 0.81% have tested positive. The initial intake process involved over 9,000 tests with 1.7% overall and 1.9% of players testing positive. The news comes amid word that the NFLPA and the NFL have agreed to stretch daily testing through September 5th. 5 days before the season is still slated to begin with the Houston Texans visiting the defending Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs. We will continue to monitor positivity rates within each club and relevant information from each team community to inform our assessment of testing frequency ahead of the regular season. The NFL planned to move to testing every other day if positive results stay under 5% through the first 2 weeks of training camp, but it was since backtracked. Per Josh Appler of Pro Football Talk, a letter from the NFL to all 32 teams reads as follows. Although the positive test for all player of Tier 1 and Tier 2 personnel across the league during the period is below 1%, no individual club rate is greater than 2%, the parties following consultation with their respective medical experts, have elected to continue to require daily testing of all players in Tier 1 and Tier 2 personnel until further notice. Obviously, NFL training camps are in full swing right now. And there are no preseasons, obviously, this year as well. But obviously, there's going to be ramp-up periods, obviously trying to get players ready for the regular season that's going to come up, if full contact practices are now going to be able to be held on Monday. Obviously, these low numbers are a good start, but now we just got to see if potentially these numbers could stay low moving on forward into the season. So clearly, as you can tell, there's a lot going on here, and there's a lot of hope and expectations. And we'll have to see what happens. We'll have to see how it all works out moving forward. But coming up next, we're going to read an article from The Ringer talking about how the NFL may have to change the way they operate based off the breaking and the shambling of the college football season. So if you want to hear about that, hear more, stay right here on the podcast.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Football Podcast. Last segment, we discussed a bunch of news. Obviously, a bunch of signings in the NFL, like Everson Griffin signing with the Cowboys, beefing up that team. Also, George Kittle getting an extension, becoming the highest paid tight end, increasing the rate of which tight ends get paid, as now they're being used just as frequently and as much as receivers are. So that obviously was great for the tight end group. And other football news and articles that we read and talked about here on the podcast. So clearly, obviously, it's going up out here. A lot of things are happening in the world of football right now, clearly with everything, and we haven't even played a single snap still with all of it going on. But now we're going to get into an article I think was very interesting from Ringer. And the title is, College Football's Fractured Season Will Change How the NFL Operates. This is by Kevin Clark. This is an article that I'm going to read to you guys and get my thoughts on at the end. Very interesting stuff, I think, is going to be in this article. It's the first time I'm reading this too, so we're going to be reading this together. Or I guess you're listening. So yeah. And I quote, college football is the backbone of the professional game. It is where the NFL gets its players, its ideas, and more than a handful of its coaches. It is the NFL's free minor league that not only develop players, but also makes them so famous that the best of them are superstars before they attend a rookie minicamp. The NFL could conceivably be the $15 billion a year juggernaut it currently is if the college game did not exist. But no one in the league wants to find out. Tuesday was not just an important moment for the college game, as 2 Power 5 conferences scrapped their fall seasons. It represented a shift, perhaps a lasting one, for the pro one. Here is what we know, which, as with all things related to the COVID-19 pandemic, is constantly evolving and confusing. The Big Ten and the Pac-12 will not play this fall. The other major conferences, the SEC, ACC, and Big 12, are planning to go forward with their seasons perceptionally on the brink. Conducting a season with non-professional players who are students on a college campus is a risk. And how many games can be played by the conferences that push forward is unknown. The Athletic's Nicole Urbach reported that a rare heart condition, myocarditis, which has been found in patients who have had COVID-19, has been detected in several Big Ten athletes. The conference is aware of at least 10 players who have this disease, an alarmingly high number for an otherwise rare condition, on the eve of preseason camp, Arbeck wrote. The biggest issue, a source from the Power 5 conference told Stadium's Brett McMurphy, is that the unknown long-term impact of COVID liability issues involved. These concerns have contributed to a wave of postponements thus far. In conversations with NFL personnel in the past week, it was hard to find a corner of the sport they didn't think would be touched by these developments. Teams might turn to college coaches as consultants or analysts for pro schemes. College prospects will fall through the cracks of the NFL development system. More teams might trade draft picks to avoid a confusing draft cycle. I was on the phone with an NFL general manager on Tuesday when the Big Ten announced its postponement. After I delivered the news, he let out a heavy sigh. Everything we both knew was going to change. The most obvious change is the draft. Even in the best case scenario for player evaluation that the SEC, ACC, Big 12, and some smaller conferences press on, NFL evaluators will be missing game film for hundreds of players. In addition, among the conferences that are on track to play this fall, stars are already announcing their intention to sit out. Defensive end Greg Rossinu is sitting out this season, even if the Miami Hurricanes don't. The most important thing, we've already seen several guys opt out. And the only thing we can control is that they played football in 2019. Titans general manager John Robinson told me Friday. We do spring scouting where we watch last year's film, whether those guys were juniors or redshirt sophomores, and we are going into senior year. Well, we watched 3 games on player A. We got time, so let's go back and watch the entire season on that player. Maybe there's a game or a series that will crystallize your evaluation or change your opinion. Game tape is invaluable to scouts and GMs, not just for the obvious reasons to watch prospects play, but for nuisances. Robinson, for instance, likes to gauge a player's competitiveness by how he performs late in blowouts. The current collective bargaining agreement calls for the draft to be held no later than June 2nd. That could be amended, especially if the league, like the Big Ten and PAC-12, attempts to play games in early 2021. But there's no real reason to draft much beyond that date. The NFL is not going to delay its 2021 season, which is scheduled to start with training camp in July, and teams need to know who is on their roster by then. Setting dates aside, the general consensus in the league is that there's not an appetite for top prospects to play in the spring, if there is any spring football. But the best players aren't participating. It might be hard for NFL teams to figure out how much legitimacy to lend to it. This is going to be complicated. Falcons general manager Thomas Dimitroff told me about the draft cycle. In today's NFL, a scout is a combination of an evaluator and a researcher. The researcher side will need to kick into high gear now. Dimitroff continued, for scouts, it's okay. Let's think about digging into research, evaluate all the video you haven't seen thus far. Most scouts have not seen the entire seasons from underclassmen. The problem is it's not going to be fresh for us. College scouting already requires projecting, and now they'll have to project even be bolder in their projections. The result will be a deeply unfair evaluation process. Remember, at this time last year, Joe Burrow was not even on draft radars by January. He was a runaway top draft pick. A point Burrow made himself earlier this week. Football moves so quickly, and now that the past 3 number 1 selections spent their final year of college answering any of all questions scouts had them, Baker Mayfield and Kyler Murray were not even close to the consensus top picks before the final few months of their college careers. It's a tough bet for any player to ready to break out in 2020. Even excelling in a disjointed college season might not be enough to shoot up draft boards in a traditional way. The reality, of course, is that the pandemic has created deeply unfair circumstances for huge swaths of players. This is true of people in nearly every facet of life. This is simply a deeply unfair year. Hundreds of players who in previous years would have tried out for teams as undrafted free agents couldn't even set foot on a pro field this offseason. Many rookies were signed as free agents and were later cut from the rosters from 98 in order to be betterly social distance. In the next draft cycle, any college players on the fringes will miss out on the chance to work out for teams. In the absolute best case scenario, they'll have to wait an additional year. Earlier this summer, the NFL team employee compared this year's rookie class to job seekers graduating into the Great Recession a decade ago. You will never get this chance back. It is a bad time for a young football player to make it. You might, however, see a little more college football influence in the NFL than you would think otherwise anticipated. The past decade of pro football schematically has been defined by liberal borrowing of college schemes. In short, the scheme world is flat. The evolution has involved a lot of phone conversations between pro coaches and college coaches about what schemes work and how to implement them. This includes Josh McDaniels and Dan Mullen, or any number of coaches calling Oklahoma head coach Lincoln Riley after Chris Olo, who popularized the pistol offense, retired as Nevada head coach. As he worked as a consultant with the Chiefs when Alex Smith was the quarterback, helping Andy Reid with schemes that would eventually take over the league. The wrinkle, if more of the college football season is scrapped, is that current coaches would be more available for more than a brief chat. They would be available for weeks at a time. A handful of NFL decision makers I spoke to this week said there would be a massive amount of interest in bringing in college coaches as informal consultants. In fact, teams might recruit them with the same favorite college coaches recruit high schoolers. In a quote from Thomas Dimitroff, he says, "I think people are going to be really focused on doing anything that's going to create a competitive advantage. And that marginal gain idea could be an insight from a college coach who is normally not available for a quick phone call." Continuing on, "I think people are going to be really focused on doing anything they can," and etc. But teams, of course, need prospects to stay active, to get some evaluation. I wondered what that looks like. So I called Quincy Avery, a private quarterback coach who has coached Deshaun Watson, Jalen Hurts, and Dwayne Haskins. Avery has told me his plan for the college quarterbacks he works with who won't be playing this fall. He intends to meet them in Atlanta and start working out in September, installing a NFL-style playbook and recruiting local wideouts and cornerbacks to play 7-on-7 games to get live reps. We can run NFL concepts that teams want to see, Avery told me. Among college players, Avery has worked with Ohio State's Justin Fields, Miami's De'Aaron King, and Boston College Anthony Brown, among others. He said he wants to work with college coaches who have worked in the NFL to flesh out the training program. There are limitations to his plan. Avery said prospects could show off their arm strength but not say their pocket presence without full contact. We are not going to be able to show a real-life situation where there's bodies flying everywhere. He equates these reps to much more elevated version of Pro Day, with the added element of competition, he said. For a generation of prospects, the key this year is to prove themselves when the system to do so has broken. It is tempting to say it will be strange, but that's too easy. What it will be extremely 2020. And that is the article right there. So, as you can tell, a lot of stuff's happening. A lot of stuff's happening right now. It's a very fluid situation. And listen, there's just a lot of questions. I've said that earlier in the show. It was just a lot of questions. A lot of uncertainty that they have to figure out and they have to come to a conclusion on, because if they don't figure it out, you're going to be leaving the college players in a bad spot, the NFL players and the NFL staffs that recruit players from college in a bad spot. And this draft, we thought this draft was interesting. Next draft is going to be interesting if there's no college football, because it almost feels like we're drafting you because we think you're this, but we don't truly know if you're this. But that's all the time we have here on the GSMC Football Podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for tuning in to another great show, letting me be part of your day. Don't forget to listen to our other amazing podcasts here on the GSMC Podcast Network. Also, don't forget to leave a review or subscribe, or whatever your platform you're listening to us on, whatever they allow you to do. Please do that. Also, don't forget to follow us on social media, so we can interact, talk football and all that good stuff. So, this is your host, Brice, signing out. Have a good day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.